7. Combat Mole. In the early 20th century, an engineer named Petr Raskazov came up with the idea of creating a futuristic vehicle that could navigate as efficiently through solid ground as a submarine does in the water, enabling its operator to breach enemy lines and destroy their bunkers. Raskazov died without turning his vision into a reality, and the concept was more or less forgotten about until the 1930s, when engineer Rudolf Trebolevsky built the first prototype. The project failed to go very far until the 1960s, when former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev supported its development. Known as Sub-Terrain, this type of vehicle plays a bigger role in fictional sci-fi storylines than it does in the real world. The only way a Sub-Terrain could efficiently travel through the ground would be with a drill tip heated to somewhere between 1,300 and 1,700 Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt rock, and the ability to apply immense pressure as it pushed its way further into the Earth. Development of what the Soviets called the Combat Mole took place under the same level of secrecy as the USSR's atomic weapon experiments. A team of scientists built a 115-foot nuclear-powered prototype that had enough room for 5 crew members and 15 soldiers. It performed well during its first test in 1964, reaching a top speed of 7 miles per hour and effortlessly cutting into a mountain. But the vehicle exploded during its second test, killing all of its crew members, and the project was abandoned. To this day, the Russians have kept quiet on what caused the accident. 6. Climate-controlling weapons. The Cold War arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union wasn't limited to guns, aircraft, and other conventional military weapons. Both world powers experimented with other potential methods of attack, including the possibility of changing the weather in ways that would hinder an enemy force and work to the operating force's advantage. The United Nations banned climate-controlling weapons in 1977, but the testing continued as scientists attempted to develop methods for manipulating the Earth's ionosphere to achieve the intended results. During the 1980s, the Soviet experiments were moved to a newly built clandestine laboratory called the Sura Ionospheric Heating Facility in the small town of Vasilsurk outside Moscow. The Sura facility is similar to the US government's High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HAARP for short. According to the University of Alaska, which runs the HAARP research program, American scientists have developed the world's most capable high-power, high-frequency transmitter for ionospheric study. Russia continues to operate its Sura facility, but given the secretive nature of the research, very little is known about what currently goes on there. Do you have any theories on what's happening at the Sura facility? Tell us in the comments below, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Trophimlessenko. Described by The Atlantic as the Soviet-era's deadliest scientist, Trophimlessenko caused an unknown number of Soviet civilians to starve to death as part of a bogus food research campaign that lasted from 1930 to 1940. At the time, scientific knowledge of genetics was in its infancy, and Lysenko seemed to believe the emerging field was a bunch of hogwash, despite being the director of the Institute of Genetics at the USSR's Academy of Sciences. He launched an all-out campaign against the field, telling the public not to believe any of what they hear, and claiming that he had developed groundbreaking farming methods that could yield abundant crops and proved that genetics was a bunch of baloney. Lysenko began heavily pushing his views, which dismissed natural selection and encouraged the belief that plants and animals can pass on traits acquired during their lifetime to their offspring, an ideology known as Lamarckism. He claimed that he could grow orange trees in Siberia and promised that his advice would lead to abundant crops. But the farming techniques that Lysenko encouraged were not only ineffective, they were outright destructive. While his smear campaign against science was extremely vocal, his real reasons for harboring such irrationally hateful beliefs were tightly guarded. Lysenko was a staunch communist, and he saw genetics and credible science in general as a threat to the system. Not surprisingly, Stalin was one of his biggest supporters, and Lysenko used the power it afforded him to imprison, exile, and execute as many as 3,000 scientists who disagreed with his teachings. As part of Lysenko's so-called farming modernization scheme, people were forced to join state-run collective farms that implemented Lysenko's methods. Farmers were required to plant seeds too close to each other and were banned from using any pesticides or fertilizers, among other crazy new rules that led to widespread crop failure. Famine ensued, and millions of people starved. Meanwhile, Stalin told Lysenko to fix the problem, but to continue pushing his destructive agenda. Lysenko remained in his position until 1965, despite the efforts of other scientists to oust him. Luckily, his influence decreased significantly following Stalin's death, and after Nikita Khrushchev's dismissal in 1964, he was no longer safe from criticism. People wasted no time speaking their true feelings, and newspapers also put Lysenko on blast. Slowly but surely, the scientific studies that he had banned were reintroduced, and there was nothing he could do about it. 4. KGB's Poison Lab. In 1921, the Soviet government built a clandestine scientific lab in Russia's Leninsky region, where scientists reportedly experimented with dangerous and deadly poisons. It was referred to simply as the Special Office, and later as Laboratory 1, Lab X, and Chimera, which means the cell in English. Because the Soviets were extremely tight-lipped about whatever went on in the building, information about what they were doing in there is limited. It's believed that they were trying to develop a tasteless, odorless poison that could kill someone and wouldn't show up in a post-mortem toxicology test. The facility was so closely guarded that its exact location is unknown, and despite its government backing, very few non-staff members were allowed inside. The building was off-limits even to most KGB agents, and only high-ranking officials seemed to gain entry. In 1954, a KGB defector claimed that the lab was located in the country's Lubyanka region, and that the scientists who worked there were testing their poisons on Gulag prisoners. The Russian government claimed that the site's closed down, but many people believe it continues to secretly operate. Over the years, numerous former intelligence officials and other insiders have accused the Kremlin of using poison to eliminate suspected foreign spies, political enemies, and other perceived enemies. There have even been rumors that Joseph Stalin poisoned Vladimir Lenin in order to secure his rise to power. The poisoning deaths have continued into modern times, and while the Kremlin denies any involvement in the murders, it also seems suspiciously uninterested in addressing the matter or catching the suspects in these cases. One of the most shocking incidents came in 2006 when former KGB officer Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with a rare radioactive isotope called polonium. He was a vocal critic of the KGB and had recently met with 2 former agents when he became violently ill. Litvinenko spent the next 3 weeks in agonizing pain as he slowly died from the toxic chemical. In 2021, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Russia is responsible for Litvinenko's death. A Kremlin spokesperson responded in a typical fashion by claiming the allegations are baseless and remarking on how the Russian government's critics lack the authority to take meaningful action against it. 3. Human Z's. Russian biologist Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was an expert in the field of artificial insemination, and he had a particular fondness for creating hybrid animals. He successfully bred a zebra donkey, also known as a zedonk or a zonkey, a rat crossed with a mouse, a guinea pig mouse hybrid, and even an antelope cow mix. In 1926, Ivanov set out to create a human Z by crossing a human with a chimp. He was given full run of a scientific lab in a part of West Africa that was known as French Guinea at the time, and even received $10,000 in funding for the project, which is the equivalent of nearly $170,000 in today's currency. Ivanov planned to extract sperm from a male chimpanzee and impregnate women without their knowledge or consent by pretending to carry out a routine medical exam. Thankfully, when the French governor learned about the experiment, he refused to allow Ivanov to proceed. The strange scientist returned to Russia where he found some female volunteers willing to participate in the project. By the time he ran out of his reserve of chimpanzee sperm, his efforts had so far been unsuccessful. He tried to obtain more sperm, but the Soviet Academy of Sciences found out about how Ivanov had planned to deceive women in Africa as part of his experiment. The institution revoked his funding, and he died in exile just a handful of years later, after being banished for unrelated reasons during a government-sponsored purge of scientists from the country. 2. Magic and mind control. Throughout the Cold War, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies sponsored top-secret research into telepathy, levitation, telekinesis, and other forms of parapsychology. By the late 70s, the CIA had admitted to at least some of its unorthodox experiments. But the KGB had no such plans, and the agency went out of its way to keep its activities a secret. In 1976, Los Angeles Times journalist Robert Toth was kicked out of Moscow for allegedly trying to obtain scientific papers detailing some of the research that was taking place behind closed doors. This is just one example of how journalists had an extremely difficult time tracking down information about what went on in the USSR's scientific laboratories. A Soviet parapsychology paper obtained by a Washington Post reporter in 1977 confirmed that the Russian government was sponsoring research into telekinesis and other psychological phenomena that most mainstream scholars dismiss as pseudoscience. Until the late 1950s, these fields were also discouraged in the Soviet Union. Researchers were finally able to obtain funding for their experiments after pointing out that the US government was investigating these topics. While few details about the Soviet experiments were available at the time, there was enough evidence available to conclude that they took the idea and ran with it. In the words of one Washington Post journalist, the KGB's fascination with these alternative forms of science towed a narrow line with occultism. More information has come to light in the years since the Soviet Union's collapse. In one project, scientists created a device called a Serpan, which they hoped would enable the human mind to control objects by generating and storing high-frequency electromagnetic radiation produced by the human brain. 1. Operation Infection. During the 1980s, the KGB launched a massive disinformation campaign in a bid to convince people that Americans invented the HIV/AIDS virus as part of a biological weapons research program. At the time, HIV and AIDS were new diseases. Medical experts knew very little about the virus and there was no treatment. Many HIV-positive people live long, healthy lives today, but back then it was a death sentence. And as it began to spread rapidly in the US, people became increasingly terrified of catching it. One blatantly false Soviet news article claimed that scientists from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention combined samples of highly pathogenic viruses to create the HIV/AIDS virus. The article also accused the CDC of experimenting with the virus on marginalized people, including racial minorities, homeless people, drug users, and gay men. Anytime there was an outbreak among a local population in a country with a US military base, KGB-backed sources pushed rumors that the Americans were responsible for getting people sick. In addition to supporting the false claims circulating in newspapers, the KGB poured massive amounts of funding into spreading the lies elsewhere, including on popular radio shows and even in scientific research papers. Its goals were to undermine American credibility, encourage anti-American sentiments, and create tensions between the US and other countries, especially in places with an American military presence. And while the campaign wasn't exactly carried out in secret, the KGB remained comfortably behind the scenes, while public figures acted as their puppets, and they took efforts to make their claims seem reliable. It's impossible to say whether the campaign is partially to blame for the fact that an overwhelming number of people continue to believe, for years, that the HIV/AIDS virus was man-made, and some still do. But it's probably safe to assume that it helped perpetuate this belief and other conspiracy theories that lack any factual backing. The operation also encouraged people not to trust medical professionals, which made patients less likely to cooperate with treatment. And the longer a person with HIV waited to start treatment, the chances of prolonging their life became increasingly slim. In that sense, it's not unrealistic to say that the propaganda campaign may have indirectly cost some people their lives. In 1992, Russian intelligence official Yevgeny Primakov admitted that the KGB was responsible for the smear campaign. By that point, it wasn't exactly rocket science to realize that the KGB definitely had something to do with the operation and most likely engineered it. Sadly, the US and Russia remain entangled in this so-called information war to this day, with the most recent disinformation campaign against America being launched in early 2023. Thanks for watching. Which one of these secret Soviet experiments shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.